Alda is one of the world's most recognisable and beloved actors. We fell in love with him as the wisecracking surgeon Hawkeye Pierce on the hit series MASH.
Most people who grew up watching reruns on a lazy Sunday afternoon remember MAS*H as the show about wisecracking army surgeons who somehow made a war zone feel like a place you wanted to visit every week. What almost nobody remembers is how close that show came to disappearing after its very first season, or how much of what ended up on screen was fought for, argued over, and in one case, pulled straight out of a genuine disaster. For 11 seasons, viewers watched Hawkeye Pierce and his fellow doctors crack jokes in a muddy operating room, and it was easy to assume the show simply arrived fully formed, funny from day one and destined for the record books. The truth behind the cameras was messier, more contentious, and in several ways far more remarkable than the finished episodes ever let on. Now that Alan Alda has crossed into his 10th decade of life, celebrating his 90th birthday this past January, the full picture of what happened on that lot in Malibu is finally coming into focus. Alda has spent the years since MAS*H ended building an entire second career around communication and storytelling. But he remains, more than any other living figure connected to the project, the person whose recollections carry the most weight when it comes to understanding how the show actually came together. This is the real story of how a small, unproven television show turned into one of the most important programs ever broadcast in America. Long before Alan Alda ever put on Hawkeye Pierce's fatigues, MAS*H existed as a novel written by a man who had actually lived through what he was describing. Richard Hooker was a pen name for H. Richard Hornberger, a surgeon who served with a mobile army surgical hospital unit during the Korean War. Hornberger spent years operating on wounded soldiers just a few miles from active combat, and the gallows humor he witnessed among his fellow doctors became the backbone of the book he eventually published in 1968, working with co-writer W.C. Hines to shape his memories into fiction. The novel mixed slapstick comedy with unflinching descriptions of triage under pressure, and that combination is exactly what caught Hollywood's attention. Director Robert Altman adapted the book into a feature film in 1970, and the movie became a surprise sensation. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, earned several Academy Award nominations, and made a considerable profit for a project nobody had expected to break out the way it did. Audiences responded to something they hadn't quite seen before, a war story that refused to glorify combat, and instead focused on the exhausted, sardonic people trying to patch soldiers back together. Altman's film leaned into improvisation and overlapping dialogue, giving the whole production a loose, almost documentary feel that made the horror of the operating room scenes land even harder against the comedy surrounding them. CBS took notice, and executives began exploring whether the concept could sustain a weekly series, even though television spin-offs of successful films were considered a financial gamble at the time, and the ongoing conflict in Vietnam made war-themed entertainment a genuinely risky subject for prime time. Studio research at the time suggested that audiences exhausted by nightly news coverage of an actual war might have little appetite for a fictional one delivered into their living rooms every week, no matter how the material was framed. It took a considerable amount of internal persuasion before the network agreed to greenlight even a pilot. When producers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds set out to adapt the concept for television, they made a deliberate choice not to simply reproduce Altman's film. They wanted a show with its own rhythm, one that kept the Korean War setting, but leaned harder into the emotional lives of the characters stationed at the fictional 4077th. Alan Alda was cast as Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, and the ensemble around him was built to feel like an actual unit of overworked, underappreciated people rather than a lineup of comedic archetypes. Alongside Alda, the ensemble included Wayne Rogers as Trapper John McIntyre, Loretta Swit as Major Margaret Houlihan, McLean Stevenson as the good-natured but overwhelmed commanding officer Henry Blake, Larry Linville as the pompous Frank Burns, and Gary Berghoff reprising his film role as company clerk Radar O'Reilly, the only actor to carry a character directly over from the movie to the series. Together they were tasked with making a fictional surgical unit feel lived in rather than staged, and much of that believability came down to small details. The exhaustion in how characters moved between scenes, the clutter of the swamp where Hawkeye and his tent mates slept, and dialogue that let jokes and grim realities sit right next to each other without a clean transition between them. The pilot episode aired on September 17, 1972, and critics responded warmly. Ratings, however, told a very different story. The show initially struggled in the Nielsen rankings, landing far outside the top tier of programming and putting its future in serious doubt. CBS executives were uneasy about a series based on an acclaimed film performing so poorly with viewers, and internal conversations reportedly turned toward whether the show was even worth continuing into a second season. Adding to the pressure, the show's time slot changed more than once during its first year as the network searched for a lineup position where it might find an audience, which only made it harder for viewers to develop the habit of tuning in every week. Part of the tension came from a fundamental disagreement about what kind of show MAS*H was supposed to be. Network leadership wanted a conventional sitcom with dependable jokes and low emotional stakes. Gelbart and Reynolds were determined to show the psychological toll of war sitting right alongside the comedy. That approach became unmistakable in the first season's 17th episode, Sometimes You Hear the Bullet, in which a childhood friend of Hawkeye's dies on the operating table. It marked the first time the show killed off a patient on screen, and it ended with Hawkeye breaking down in his bloodstreak scrubs. Network executives worried the scene was too heavy for a comedy time slot, but the writers held their ground, betting that audiences would respect a show willing to take real emotional risks. Despite that creative breakthrough, ratings remained sluggish through the winter of the first season. What ultimately rescued the show wasn't a dramatic creative pivot, but a scheduling decision. CBS ran the first season in reruns throughout the summer of 1973, and with less competition on the air, more households discovered the series for the first time. Then the network made the move that changed everything. It slotted MAS*H directly after All in the Family, which was, at the time, the most watched program in the country. Viewers who were already tuned in simply stayed put, and the show's audience exploded almost overnight, catapulting it into the top 10. Success, though, didn't ease the friction between the creative team and network executives. If anything, it intensified it. As MAS*H became one of CBS's flagship programs, network censors grew increasingly nervous about how dark some scripts had become. Certain executives reportedly joked that the show had drifted from situation comedy into what they called situation tragedy. Standards and practices departments pushed back on visible blood during surgical scenes, worried it would unsettle families watching during dinner, and insisted on stripping certain words from scripts before filming could begin. Entire storylines that touched on subjects like battlefield trauma, military bureaucracy failing wounded soldiers, or the psychological aftermath of combat were sent back for revisions or shelved outright because network standards departments considered them too heavy for a comedy slot. Gelbart, who served as head writer for the show's earliest and arguably most influential seasons, has described the writer's room during that period as a constant negotiation between what the network would tolerate and what the story genuinely required. He and Reynolds pushed to keep episodes grounded in the reality that people were dying just beyond the camera's frame, arguing that softening that reality would cheapen everything else the show was trying to do. That tension between commercial caution and creative ambition shaped nearly every season of the show's run, even after it had become one of the most profitable programs on the network schedule. The most consequential battle, though, revolved around the laugh track. In an era when nearly every sitcom used a canned laughter track to cue audience reactions, Gelbart and Reynolds argued that inserting artificial laughter over scenes depicting doctors fighting to save dying soldiers was fundamentally wrong for the tone they were building. CBS wouldn't remove the laugh track from the show entirely, but after sustained pushback from the production team, the network agreed to a compromise. No laugh track would ever play during scenes set inside the operating room. That single concession gave the surgical scenes a stark, uncushioned quality that set the show apart from every other comedy of its era, and it remains one of the clearest examples of how much creative control the writers were willing to fight for. Just as the show hit its commercial stride, its cast began to change in ways nobody had anticipated. McLean Stevenson, who played the beloved commanding officer Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, decided to leave after the third season in pursuit of starring roles of his own rather than staying inside an ensemble. Rather than sending Henry home to a quiet, happy retirement, the writers chose an ending that stunned the country. In the season 3 finale, titled Abyssinia Henry, the character is granted an honorable discharge and boards a plane bound for the United States, only for Radar to walk into the operating room moments later and read a telegram reporting that Henry's plane went down over the Sea of Japan with no survivors. To capture authentic, unrehearsed reactions from the rest of the cast, the production reportedly withheld that final twist from most of the actors until shortly before the scene was filmed. Viewer response was immediate and intense, with CBS receiving a flood of complaints from audiences who felt blindsided by the character's death. Not long afterward, Wayne Rogers, who played Hawkeye's close friend Trapper John McIntyre, also departed the series. Rogers had never signed a formal contract for the role and had grown frustrated that his character was being pushed to the margins as storylines increasingly centered on Alda's Hawkeye. His exit was handled with minimal on-screen explanation, and the abrupt nature of both departures fueled ongoing speculation in entertainment press about behind-the-scenes tension, including rumors that Alda's growing creative influence over the show was squeezing out other cast members. Alda has generally pushed back on the idea that he was responsible for pushing colleagues out, pointing instead to the ordinary pressures of a long-running series. Actors wanting bigger opportunities, contract disputes, and creative disagreements about where each character's story should go. Larry Linville, who played the antagonistic Frank Burns, left after the show's 5th season as well, having said in interviews around that time that he felt the character had reached the natural end of his arc, and that continuing to play him as pure comic relief would have flattened him further. Whatever the internal dynamics actually were, the production moved quickly to stabilize the ensemble, bringing in Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt and Harry Morgan as Colonel Sherman Potter, along with David Ogden Stiers as Major Charles Emerson Winchester III, all of whom went on to become fixtures of the show for the remainder of its run. Rather than treating these transitions as disruptions to paper over, the writers frequently used them to deepen the show's exploration of loss, giving the camp's remaining characters space to grieve and adjust in ways that mirrored what real military units experienced when personnel rotated out. Even as the cast reshaped itself, the production remained committed to portraying the Korean War experience with as much accuracy as television budgets and standards would allow. Members of the creative team traveled to Korea to speak directly with doctors and nurses who had served in real MASH units, gathering first-hand accounts of overnight surgeries and camp life that were later folded into scripts. That research helped ground even the show's more comedic episodes in something closer to lived experience. For the outdoor sequences, the production used Malibu Creek State Park, whose hills bore a passable resemblance to the Korean countryside. Filming there was physically demanding. Cast members spent long days in heavy wool uniforms under the California sun, contending with dust, heat, and unpredictable conditions to make the fictional camp feel like a real place under siege. The permanent outdoor set, built to represent the camp of the 4077th, became so familiar to the cast and crew over the years that several actors later described it as feeling more like an actual second home than a soundstage backdrop, with genuine mud, dust, and worn equipment standing in for anything a set decorator might have faked on an indoor stage. That reliance on a single outdoor location eventually collided with real disaster. As the production geared up to film its farewell season in the early 1980s, a wildfire swept through the dry hills surrounding Malibu Creek, forcing cast and crew to evacuate and destroying much of the outdoor set. Rather than treat the fire purely as a setback, the writers folded the event into the story itself, scripting an episode in which the camp is forced to evacuate because of a fire tearing through the area. The smoke and charred equipment audiences saw on screen were largely the genuine aftermath of that real blaze. By its final seasons, MAS*H was one of the most reliably profitable programs on CBS's schedule, and network executives were eager to keep it running as long as possible. Alda and the rest of the creative team felt differently. They worried that continuing indefinitely would eventually dilute the show's quality, and they wanted to end the series while it was still operating at its creative peak rather than let it decline into repetition. CBS ultimately agreed to a supersized series finale, and Alda took on directing duties for the send-off himself, ensuring the ending matched the tone the show had built over 11 seasons. Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen aired on February 28, 1983, running nearly 2.5 hours rather than the standard half-hour format. The episode brought the various storylines of the war's final days together, following characters through the practical chaos of a ceasefire alongside quieter, more personal moments of reckoning with what the war had cost each of them individually. The anticipation surrounding the broadcast was enormous, with entire communities organizing around watching it together, restaurants and bars advertising special screenings, and utility companies later noting a measurable spike in water usage during the commercial breaks, as millions of viewers rushed to the bathroom rather than miss a minute of the story itself. When the numbers came in, they far exceeded expectations. The episode drew more than 105 million viewers, with estimates including group viewings pushing the total audience past 120 million. It posted a 60.3 rating and a 77 share, meaning more than 3 out of every 4 televisions in use that night were tuned to the same broadcast. Decades later, it remains the most-watched scripted television episode in American history, a record no program in the streaming era has come close to challenging, a reflection not just of the show's popularity, but of a television landscape that no longer exists, one where a handful of networks could still command nearly the entire country's attention on a single night. The series' cultural footprint didn't end with its finale. Reruns became a massive syndication business through the following decades, generating hundreds of millions of dollars for the studio and keeping the show in constant rotation on local stations and later on cable networks. When streaming platforms arrived, all 251 episodes found a new home there, introducing the series to audiences who hadn't been born when it originally aired. Beyond the financial legacy, MASH reshaped expectations for what a half-hour television program could accomplish. Before the show proved otherwise, network executives generally treated comedy and drama as separate lanes. A series was either a light-hearted sitcom or a serious drama, rarely both within the same episode. MASH demonstrated that a single episode could pivot from genuine comedy to genuine grief without losing its audience, laying creative groundwork that later dramedies like ER and Scrubs would build on directly. Later medical dramas frequently cited the show's operating room sequences as a template for how to depict the mechanics of surgery honestly, without turning an episode into something too clinical or too gruesome for a general audience to sit through. The show's influence also extended into how television approached veterans and the psychological aftermath of war more broadly. Long before terms like post-traumatic stress disorder entered everyday conversation, MAS*H was depicting characters who cracked under the strain of what they witnessed, who self-medicated with dark humor, and who carried the weight of impossible decisions long after the operating room lights went out. That willingness to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it neatly within a single episode gave later writers permission to treat trauma as something that lingers rather than something a character simply overcomes by the closing credits. The passage of time has also taken its toll on the original cast. In May 2025, Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan throughout the series' entire run, passed away. She was among the small number of actors who appeared in both the pilot and the finale, and her death left only 4 surviving members of the show's original core ensemble. Alan Alda turned 90 in January 2026, and in the months since, he has spoken publicly and candidly about what it means to reach that age while continuing to manage Parkinson's disease, a diagnosis he first revealed in 2018 after having lived with the condition privately for several years. Speaking at a public event in New York this past spring, Alda described the small, almost comic indignities of aging, joking about being greeted as an older gentleman by restaurant staff, and remarking that all 3 of his daughters are now old enough to be on Medicare themselves. He has described managing the condition as something that has grown from a part-time concern into nearly a full-time one, while insisting that the daily process of adapting to new limitations still leaves him looking for the humor in the situation. That attitude tracks closely with how Alda has approached the legacy of MASH itself, of the original ensemble, He remains one of only a handful of primary cast members still alive, alongside Mike Farrell, Jamie Farr, and Gary Berghoff, and interviewers who sit down with him inevitably return to those 11 years in the fictional 4077th, no matter how much else he has accomplished since. Alda has continued to work well past the point most actors of his generation retired, taking on roles across film and television long after MASH ended, and later channeling much of his time into the Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University, an initiative built around helping scientists and doctors explain complicated ideas to the public in plain, human terms. Friends and collaborators have often pointed out that the same instinct that made Hawkeye Pierce believable as both a joker and a healer is what later drove Alda toward work focused on communication and empathy off-screen as well. What Alda tends to emphasize, though, isn't the show's ratings records or its enduring syndication income. It's the recurring experience of strangers approaching him to say that watching Hawkeye Pierce work through exhaustion and grief in that operating room shaped their decision to become doctors themselves. For a show that started as a dark comedy about a war fought decades before most of its later fans were born, that kind of real-world impact is difficult to measure, but impossible to dismiss. Even now, managing a progressive illness in his 10th decade, Alda has continued to describe his approach to aging the same way he once described the writing on MAS*H itself, as a matter of finding the humor embedded in even the hardest circumstances, not because the hardship isn't real, but because laughing at it is sometimes the only way to keep moving forward. More than 40 years after its finale aired, MAS*H still holds up as proof that television could take audiences seriously enough to show them both the absurdity and the horror of war in the same breath, and that humor, far from trivializing suffering, could be one of the only ways people actually survive it. Alan Alda helped build that idea scene by scene, argument by argument, and even now, in his 10th decade, he remains its clearest living reminder. What's your favorite Hawkeye Pierce moment from the entire run of MAS*H? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look back, be sure to like and subscribe for more.